Good afternoon, everyone. So, today's topic is mainly based on the API based practices that everybody should be following, and I'll be doing a demo of some of the things that we are going to talk about, and obviously I'll share the code if you are interested. So before we start, last 3 years, I think there were no in-person conferences for a reason, because of pandemic, right? I'm sure many of you are attending very first in-person conference after pandemic, right? We had seen a lot of change in the way we live, the lot of choices that we used to make, and what choices that we are making in our life. Exact same stress things has gone with all the businesses as well. The businesses were pushed to rethink their business strategy and employ more and more digital transformation as part of their IT strategy as a result of change in business strategy. There are so many companies, they survived or they grow in this pandemic are the ones they had an effective digital transformation strategy in place. The technology that kind of underpins everything that these companies has seen is the API and cloud and DevOps, and these are all common technologies. This report or the graph that we are looking at it, is from Postman. Everybody knows Postman is a testing tool, right? The important thing I wanted to point out is that the number of collections. So, when you go on Postman, you create a collection, you build your APIs, you define your API as part of the collections, and then, you use it for testing. In January 2019, the number of collections they had was 17.4 million. Right after 1 year, which is January 2020, it became 34 million, 100% increase in the collections. What does it mean? It means that the overall adoption of an API has increased a lot during this pandemic, because all the companies started changing the way they are doing business. And that's the result. You look at the Shopify stocks, or you look at the Instacart, they used to have a handful of vendors and before a pandemic, and now they have a plethora of vendors, subscribing for Instacart. By 2021, this number of collections has become 46 million. So what's important out of all these things is the pandemic. So these are the key takeaways of the report. The pandemic has changed the world, and world responded with APIs. The other three takeaways are all about how APIs are helpful to the business. They still hold the value to the business. The API ecosystem is now became global and growing. There are no borders comes into play when you are building a business, especially a B2D platform, where business to developers platform, where you build a platform, you expose your data as an API, and the developers come in, they build the applications using your data. There is no borders coming into play. Developers are spending more time on building an API. There is other report from Forrester. They talked about that 80% of the time now developers are spending in building API rather than building the conventional standard applications. Then the most important thing about now, here it comes, the quality of API has become top priority. And that's for the API design and implementation point of view. This is the very important point for me that's going to drive this entire conversation today. And the other last 2 points are all about what companies should do for driving their API strategy. And most of the companies are embracing now API first philosophy, and then API first philosophy is really paying off to them, right? So these are the key takeaways. Now, we talked about API first strategy. This is not a new word. This is not a new thing. This has been there in the industry for so many years. But usually what happens, right? When you as a company tries to build an API first strategy, most of our discussion happens something like this. The discussions are all about how my microservice should be, whether it should be 100 lines of code or whether it should be 1,000 lines of code. Where am I going to deploy it? How am I going to deploy it? Am I going to use containers, Kubernetes, or, these are the discussions that we generally have while building and defining an API-first strategy. But, before even we get there, so as part of the same report, right, what they had done was they did an interview of a handful of people. They tried to figure it out from the executives. What do they mean by API-first strategy? What do they mean by API-first? Some people, majority of people, they are saying that API design is considered early before the development kicks off. So, in any API development methodology, you can do a top-down API development or bottom-up API development. That's quite common. And that's what, everybody echoes that, it should be top-down. You should consider design, and you should focus on design before start building an API. There are some people, they even went to an extreme. They are saying that API design is considered first before stakeholders' expectations. So even before you learn all your requirements from the stakeholders, you should start thinking about building an API. That's again an extreme, But the important point of this graph is that API design is really important, equally important compared to your API tools and technology for defining an API-first strategy for the organization. Now, what are the API development priorities? So we talked about it. One of the main key takeaways was the quality. Other one is, obviously agility, reliability, security, performance. These are all top priorities while you are building an API, or rather designing an API. Now, if we try to compare API design and development with, the culinary arts, it's like, if I'm just an hobbyist and cook, sometimes you have to cook because, somebody who is cooking for you is not, you crack a bad joke and then, to your wife, and now she's not cooking for you, so you have to cook, right? So if you are somebody like me, who is this guy, the way you're gonna build the recipe will be very different versus somebody who is really professional chef building the recipe. The number of recipes he can build or cook, and the quality of the recipes he can cook is very different compared to what I can do by myself, right? Now, if we try to compare this analogy to an API development, we got a lot of stakeholders when we are building an API, right? And they come with a lot of different requirements. It's our job as an API craftsman or API ninja is to build the foundation right from get-go, so that all the APIs that we build on top of that foundation, covering all the cross-cutting concerns, that helps you build a comprehensive API. Now, what do I mean by building a foundation? So, sorry about that. Number one thing is building RESTful API. Well, it's quite trivial in this day and age. Building an API is what? You just write whatever code you have, you just put an annotation on top of it. Your code you will be start exposing your code as a RESTful API. And if you want an API documentation, you put another annotation on top of it and you're done, right? It's not about, how trivial is the API implementation is. The biggest problem an enterprise faces, and we had seen firsthand, is the API discovery. In old worlds, it's like if you have to work on so-and-so API, if you want to know about, the customer's API, you go and meet John. If you want to go and work on pricing API, you go and meet Mark, right? That's how it works in organization. API discovery is the biggest problem. The things that RESTful APIs help solve compared to SOAP API is that it brought a lot of conventions into the play. And that made an API quite intuitive because that, how your operations are going to map out to the actual actions that HTTP actions that you're gonna do. It's quite a very simple fundamental. But most important aspect of everything is your design of an URI. This is something where we pay the least amount of focus or attention. I'll give you an example. So there are so many different ways you can build a save customer API, right? You can basically you can go with the convention. You can map it out. Like, your save method, which is nothing but the create method, you map it to post, but you are not restricted, right? You can always create an URI where you say /save customers, and you are good to go with that, right? So by looking at so many different patterns that people have implemented, there are 4 different archetypes that you can use for building an URI, and these are very well defined. For an example, if you are looking for a resource, a document. When we say document, we are talking about an individual record, right, of a given resource. The first thing you want to do is that, and that's the document archetype. Your URI should always be /customers and it will be a key, the key that identifies that particular resource. The other archetype collection, it will return you the list of objects back. That should always be like, /name of the resources in plural, right? This is all common. The things that I wanted to point out is that there is one archetype which is quite common. It's called controller archetype. And what do I mean by that? So for an example, RESTful API is good at defining convention. You can map your actions with the HTTP methods, right? But let's say, you have to build a business API like credit check. What are you going to do? Is it going to directly map to the actions? No, it's not going to directly map. That means you need to have something like /customer /John /credit check, right? So credit check is basically a pointer as part of your URI to call a particular method that helps you do a credit check. And this is very powerful pattern, archetype, I should say. All 3 archetypes that we looked at it up on top can be implemented with the controller archetype. In fact, the entire SOAP-based API design and RPC-based API design was focused on or concentrated on this controller design pattern. The problem that it brings to the table is it makes your API discovery harder and harder, because that leads to an API sprawl problem. Because you don't know, when you start doing this, save customer, create customer, this, that, you don't know that, after some time, if I have to save customer, what is something that I should be using it? The other things about, obviously, naming conventions, follow standard, define a standard, whatever is your standard, right? Like, for example, if you want to build a resource name which is multi-word, then, you might use an hash instead of underscore. This very small things. These are important because there is, if you look at the programmable web report, every year there are 2,000 APIs are getting added. If you are building an API for growing your business, these small things are really helpful in making your API easy to use, and that's going to increase the API adoptions, and that also increase the growth opportunity for your business. The other things, API documentation, super important. When we talk about API documentation, we are talking about the live document where people can come and try the API. Now, input data validation, that's the second recipe. I think the only thing that I want to point out is that, as part of your API program, this is a cross-cutting concern, have a standard framework defined based on some sort of standards, rather than building your own custom framework for doing input data validations. But the most important aspect is that leverage a consistent error handling mechanism for giving your response back when there is an error because user has not provided some value in the way you expect him to provide. The other thing is, APIs are the biggest interest of hackers these days. The lot of security attacks are happening now on API because they shifted their focus, because they know that the world's most important data is now being exposed as an API. It's very important that as part of input data validation, you also do an input sanitization that's going to help you increase your API security. And you can also use API gateways and stuff like that. Now, so far what we talked about, building an API. And that's all good, right? The next thing I want to talk about is you built an API. Now, tomorrow, your customer comes back and he says, hey, you know what, this API works fine, but we want to build a mobile application. And I want you to, can I use the same API? You say, yeah, of course, you use it, right? Now, I would have built a domain object because, API microservices design pattern is all about domain-driven design pattern, where you define your domain with all the fields that you want to expose. You might have defined your domain object with so many fields on it. Now, what's going to happen is that the customer will come back and say that, hey, you know what, but this API doesn't work for me, for my mobile. He's like, can you give me a subset of the fields, because this is really impacting the performance of an API. And performance and reliability is the most important aspect for the API adoption. So what we can do here, how we can go about implementing this, right? So one is controller resource, as we talked about it. Controller resource where you build the API endpoint that does exactly this, right? An example could be that /customer/1/lite. That means you are saying anything coming as /lite is for the mobile interface. The problem, more controller resource you use, is gonna lead to an API sprawl. Some people, they also use versioning for that, and that's the anti-pattern. They would be like version 1 for web and version 2 for mobile. Versions are not built for that. The best way of doing this could be, sorry about that. So other way of doing that could be that, identifying path. So what is identifying path here? So identifying path is the mechanism where before even you define your URI, you can define some sort of prefix. And reason why you do it before your resource. So there are plenty of advantages of doing that. Because, when you do this way, you are not impacting your RESTful resource conventions that we talked about, the URI convention. So you can do this way. But underneath, again, is going to implement controller pattern as well. The most elegant way of doing this could be that you can implement some sort of field selector. So you keep your API interface exactly same, so people don't have to remember anything if they know their domain and if they know how their domain is mapped to what resource, and that's about it. So your API would look like /customer/1. That's the ID of a customer, and if you come up with some sort of field selector, that will basically help you define the fields like this. It's going to help you reduce the overfetching problem. That's the problem that we were dealing with the mobile interface, right? Underfetching and overfetching. These are the biggest contributor to the API performance. When you are doing overfetching, more network latency is going to impact your performance. When you are doing underfetching, now you have to make multiple API calls. That's also going to impact your performance. Now, next thing is, now customer comes back. He says, okay, this is all good. But, I want to build a functionality where I want to look at all the customers who are living in New York City. So what are we going to do? And that's where the API sprawl starts happening, right? Then one approach is, again, controller resource. You build a specific API endpoint for that. Other one is, you can build some sort of lightweight querying mechanism, right? You can use whatever. If you want to use GraphQL, you use GraphQL. If you want to build if you want to use some other technique, you can use some other techniques. Most important things here is that make sure that you use a standard specification or de facto standard for doing this, because these things are like slippery path. One example, like if I have to build this functionality living in New York City, if I had gone with this approach of controller resource, there's so much I can do, because tomorrow the same business user is going to come and ask me for getting the users from New York City and San Francisco. How am I going to do it, right? So whatever you implement here, it should be based on some sort of specification rather than building your own homegrown solution. Still, even though you take care of the overfetching, underfetching problems and API sprawl problems that we talked about, API performance is not guaranteed to be great until you implement, paginations for the controller resources that we talked about. Controller resources are the ones which are returning a list of objects. Obviously, there are multiple approaches. There is nothing new here, like client-side, DB level, or server-side pagination that you can do. Most important aspects of the API, if the API is still slow, you can do caching. I think in caching, the most important aspect is, obviously, we all do this, server-side caching, distributed caching is all common. I think, from the RESTful API point of view, make sure that, you have a proper caching policy via cache control headers implemented. Now, the last but not least for the performance, improving the performance of an API as well as reliability of an API is the implementing some sort of compressions for your API, especially for the collections archetypes. Usually, what happens is, even though we had done everything, caching, underfetching, overfetching, we took care of everything, there are still chances that your API payload is such a huge payload, it's going to bring a lot of data to the browser from the server. It takes very simple thing to implement compression, because most of the browsers supports compression out of the box, like gzip and so many other known compression algorithms are supported. You just have to basically build some sort of custom annotations, some sort of functionality. Again, part of building a foundation, right? So everybody don't reinvent the wheel. Build some sort of annotations that works for you, and you can say, for whatever API that's returning a collection object, you can add the compressions on top of it. Make sure that you compress only, because compression overhead should not impact to the performance as well, right? So that's why you can be selective about when to do it and when not to do it. So you should have a mechanism of toggling that on and off. So with that, what I'll do is very simple. Quickly, I'll show you a quick demo of how you can go about building this functionality. Everything that we talked about, how easy it is to build.
We just started, anything start different?
We're also running a little long, so
Okay. I think you just want to.
Just hold on and see that might be the trick.
Okay.
I'll be back.
Okay.
Must have just been a little-
So now I have very simple example here. It's a RESTful API. Yeah, maybe I can take questions while I'm, yeah.
All right, any questions from anybody?
The only one I had was every time I wrote down a question, you were answering it on the next slide, so that was good. The one thing you didn't talk about was events. Are you thinking about events in any way, asynchronous?
Yeah, so I mean, async API has been a standard that's getting higher adoption, right? There's also a report. I think the vendor is downstairs as well. They have a report on different types of API standards, specification, and how their adoptions are going. Async API, that's relatively new standards, is catching up a lot. It's on the growing trajectory, and then HTTP or RESTful API is like on the downward trajectory, obviously, because GraphQLs and everything is picking up. So yeah, I mean, definitely. It's not only the async API, but also, if you are building an HTTP-based RESTful API, employing an HTTP2 is also a big plus point for driving the API performance and the the kind of models that you implement for the API.
All right, very
good. Okay.